Continuing our reading in Yellow Eyes by Rutherford Montgomery, Chapter 13, Flight. Yellow Eyes was filled with a great loneliness as he lay on a ledge overlooking the valley and stared into the moonlighted vista below. At intervals, soft snarls arose in his broad chest, lonely sounds which the cold breeze off the mountain lifted and swept away toward the pale North Star. Uneasily, he swung his head, as though half expecting to feel the caressing tongue of the Golden One, smoothing his sleek neck and cheek. The king cat had developed into a powerful machine of sinew and fiber. Lean, stringy muscles played over his loose skin. His paws, spread out on the ledge, were large and gave him the appearance of being out of proportion. Yellow Eyes was a fully developed killer, entering the first flush of his power and strength. As he learned the truth which comes to all wild things sooner or later, man is master, a destroying God who kills ruthlessly every animal who annoys, inconveniences, or in any way bothers him. Man, the master killer, was warring on the big cat. The destruction of the Golden One and the stealing of his babies had shown the big cat what he might expect. His memory stirred, and he remembered the slender she-cat, his babies, and the dreamy summer days in the cave. His snarl rose to a rumble, and he lifted his tawny belly from the ledge. Restless loneliness drove him to action, and though through it all, a great hatred of man was growing. Caution and cunning would be a part of that hate. He would avoid the open meadow by day and would travel far back, away from the hunting grounds of Cougar George, the ancient urge of the wild, to shove back from the sound of the woodsman's axe. The burnt clearing with its cultivated fields, the beaten trails and brown roads, was strong upon him. Like the wolverine and the bear and the mountain sheep, he was retreating before the civilizing hand of man. Up the ridge he loped. His back was upon the haunts where his mind had met Golden One, where they had raised their brood of spotted babies, where tragedy had struck. He was headed for a new country, into the barren lands where he might dispel the loneliness within him. Mile after mile slipped away. The timber began to thin to scrub growth. The wind was keener, and there was a smell of damp moss in the air. Frost sparkled beside the granite boulders along the slope. Presently he left the timber, and his great paths lifted and fell upon rock, granite, lime, and igneous formations covered with moss. He had passed the timber line and was crossing the backbone of the Rockies. Masses of hard-packed, grimy snow lay on either side. A naked shoulder of granite thrust itself above the ridge, blotting out the moon. Through the blackness, the great cat slid along like a yellow specter. Beyond the barren pass, his feet began to descend again, and he was soon in scrub timber. Later he entered the spruce and aspen stands and rested on a ledge overlooking a different valley. Until dawn, he lay and looked down into this misty depths of this new country, his yellow eyes open wide, his great forepaws thrust out before him. This valley was not unlike the one he had just quitted. Canyons, slotted ridges sloped down into the blue mist. The smells of vegetation came up to him upon a wind that was warm and to which clung a hint of yellow dust. The next day Yellow Eyes slept in a cleft under a rim. He had not hunted that morning. His gaunt sides were lean after the long run he had made, but he was not hungry. Through the day he slept fitfully, waking again and again, stirred by the breaking of a twig or the rustle of a chipmunk or the harsh cry of a pinyon jay. When sunset blazed over the ridge, he opened his eyes and moved to the rim of the ledge. In a jumble of rock below him, a coney was building a haystack. The big-eared creature was working diligently. He carried a straw at a time from a grassy patch below the slide and laid them neatly in a pile. Little larger than a chipmunk, he looked twice as big because of his ears. After he had deposited each straw, he sat up and whistled. In his younger days, Yellow Eyes would have chased the coney. Possibly, he would have slipped down and caught the furry haymaker. The coney would have made a tasty bite, but the great cat did not move. Life had suddenly become grimmer and harsher. His playtime was over, and he was a lone marauder, a freebooter and bandit, a killer with a price on his head. He yawned mightily and flexed his powerful legs. Getting to his feet, he leaped from the ledge. The coney squeaked with fright and whisked away under a rock. Yellow Eyes slid down through the heavy timber. He meant to see what manner of hunting this new domain afforded. Deer sign and elk sign were plentiful in the higher valleys. Lower down he came upon a sign which made him uneasy. Cattle ranged the slopes. Many of them lived in the country below timberline. That meant but one thing: humans. Man. He snarled and his neck scuff rose as he paused to nose the hoof track of a horse. Later, besides the spring, he came upon man smell. There had been a camp. Dead ashes lay in a hole between two rocks. Tin cans were piled in another hole. Yellow Eyes warily examined the campsite. Turning back along the mountain, he traveled swiftly away from the valley he had been following. He wanted none of a country where man dwelt. Forgotten was his desire to hunt. He passed many meadows in which deer were feeding, but he did not pause to stalk or to kill. Miles away, along the mountain, he came to a halt, his way barred by a glistening mesh fence. Snarling, he leaped back from this strange barrier, his tail lashing and his fangs bared. Beyond the fence, a dog began barking furiously. Yellow Eyes could hear the dog rushing out toward the fence. He stood for a moment, tensed and waiting, his shoulders sinking low as he crouched. The dog came on, and Yellow Eyes, his rage surging within him, waited. To destroy a dog would be a relief for the torment that filled him. But a sound floated up on the wind, a man's voice calling harshly to the dog. It was followed by a sharp metallic click, the sound of a cartridge being jammed into a chamber of a rifle. Yellow Eyes whirled and leaped straight down the slope into the black shadows of a thicket. From there, he headed upward again and ran on for miles. In every valley and along every rushing stream he found the scent of man. The slope he had come to upon crossing the divide was settled by ranchers and cattlemen. It was more accessible, and the grass was better than on the far side of the range. In winter, the desert, which spread from the foothills eastward, offered winter range, snow-free and sheltered. To the great cat it seemed the foothills and the wooded slopes teemed with the animal he hated. The scent of man was upon every trail he crossed, beside every spring, and on every ridge. Through that night and until daylight flooded the mountain, the king cat wandered on, ever searching for a domain free from the enemy he hated. But he found no such haven. That day he lay in a dense thicket and dozed restlessly while the sun wheeled upward and dipped toward the western mountains beyond the desert. That night he killed a fawn and feasted. After eating his fill, he wandered on at a slow trot, his face toward the desert below. Across the low foothills he padded out into the broken country. Sand drifts, still warm from the heat of the sun, pressed underfoot. Arroyos with perpendicular clay sides blocked his path. He went into the new country eagerly. Day found him on a pinnacle in the desert. The rocky fastness he had selected rose from the broken floor of the desert like the ramparts of a fortress. A scant growth of mesquite clung to the ledge where he lay. Everywhere, as far as he could see, stretched a desolate land, parched and dry. This must be a place where man would not come. He dropped his head upon his paws and slept. A skulking coyote paused beside the pinnacle and sniffed the air. His sensitive nose detected the odor of a lion, and his lips curled in a snarl. He avoided the rocky castle and slipped away across the sand. He knew that cougars living in the desert were usually hungry and would charge any living thing they met. The sun rose above the silent landscape, and the varied colors of the desert began to gleam and shimmer. A smoky haze settled over the scene. The mountains Yellow Eyes had quitted shone like pale pictures done in pastel colors against a gray-blue canvas. The heat increased and beat upon the sandy spot with a fierce penetration. Yellow Eyes stirred, and his tongue lolled over his fangs. His eyes opened and closed, and his lean sides worked steadily as he breathed. Unused to the heat, he began to feel smothered and choked. He got up and looked out into the white sunlight. The idea of starting on across that glaring expanse with no cover to protect him made him draw back. He lay down again and remained still and unmoving while the heat increased and the wind died. There was no moving life about him, as he had always known it in the big woods, save the speck of black above the sky, which marked the rigid pinion wheeling of a buzzard and the quick flash of a brown lizard now and then, a movement so swift in its darting flight that even the sharp eyes of the big cat could not follow it. Evening came, and with it a sudden coolness that made the big cat flex his muscles eagerly. He leaped down from his hiding place and trotted out into the mesquite-tufted sand, flat below the rocky pinnacle. He was seeking a watering place. Unerring instinct told him that life would gather where there was water. After several hours of moving, he located a water hole in a canyon. He smelled the scent of rabbit and of birds in the narrow path he had followed. Then he halted and stood rigid and tense. The wind blowing up the canyon brought him the smell of a human habitation. There was the odor of a stable or corral and the smell of sheep. With it all was mingled a faint scent of humankind. The big killer stood and tested the wind for a long time. With a low snarl, he whirled and loped back up the canyon and out upon the desert. There was no haven for him, no place where man had not settled, except the barren lands where he could not live. Yellow Eyes faced back toward the mountains. That night he killed a lamb in a raid upon a sleeping herd. The sheepdogs made a great stir, and 2 Mexican herders rushed from their shelter, firing revolvers and shouting. Yellow Eyes did not drop the lamb, but leaped away with it in his jaws. He had taken another step toward fitting into the life he must lead. And that is the end of chapter 13.